I'm looking out into this audience, and only about a fraction of you have heard me speak before, but those of you who do know what's going to be coming next, which is that I never give a speech in the normal way of speech giving. I always do something interactive with the audience. And so I'm going to be asking you to work with me today, because you'll get a lot more out of this presentation as you actually experience some of the things I'll be talking about. I'm going to ask all of the men to sit over on this side, and all of the women to sit over on this side, and we'll be doing something interactive that will allow us to see the results in relation to a pay gap much more easily. So in case you forgot who you are, it's men over here and women over here, okay? What I found was that there are 25 differences between what men and women do in the workplace, that each of those differences on average lead to men earning more money, but each of those differences also lead to women having better lives. So once again, the women have outsmarted us. So the book, therefore, does not suggest that women should do each of these things, because I obviously want women, I have 2 daughters, I want women to have better lives and men to have better lives, but it suggests that there are 25 significant decisions that when all those decisions are controlled for, that men today actually earn less money than women do for the same work. They earn more money than women do for 25 different types of decisions at work. But obviously those decisions allow for a roadmap to be created for any woman who wants to earn more money. But that going through each of those decisions, she can find 25 different ways to earn more money than the average man should she wish to. However, each of those decisions come with trade-offs. When you move quickly, when you work extra hours, oftentimes you don't enjoy it as much when you work in certain fields like hazardous occupations. Most people don't enjoy dying as much. And so the outcome of doing these things that earn more money do not necessarily lead to a better life. So I interviewed top women who have succeeded in the world in terms of financial success, and I say to them, if you were to talk to your granddaughter and advise her as to what you would do over again, what would you do differently? What would you do the same? I always say granddaughter because your children never listen. So now I'm going to ask us, though, to test out this thesis in our own lives right here in the room. So I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. I'm going to ask you to stand up if you fit a certain description. I'm going to ask you to look around and get a sense as to whether there are more men than women standing up. And I'm going to be asking you to count the number of times that you stand up. So keep track of the number of times that you stand up. So at the end, I'll be asking for some calculations so we can see right here in this room the different decisions or the similar decisions that men and women make. So I'm going to ask you to stand up if you work in a field of technology or the hard sciences, such as pharmacology or the hard sciences or in computer sciences or engineering. So stand up if you work in one of those fields. Okay, we have maybe 7 men and no women in this room working in technology, the hard sciences. Each of these are decisions that men versus women make, and each time you stand up, those are one of the indicators of what leads to high pay. Second, stand up if you are working in a field that is hazardous for at least 2, or have worked in a field that is hazardous for at least 2 or more years of your life. Stand up. Stand up if you work in a field that exposed you to the wind, the rain, and the snow, what I call an exposure profession, for at least 2 years of your life. Stand up if you work in a field in which you cannot psychologically check out at the end of the day. So, for example, a corporate attorney can't usually check out at the end of the day. A librarian usually can check out at the end of the day. Stand up if you work in a field that is less fulfilling than a field in which you would choose to work in had you won the lottery. Stand up if you work in a field that is less fulfilling than a field you would choose to work in had you won the lottery. That's about 80% of the men and about 15% of the women. Stand up if you work in a field in which you work the worst shifts during the worst hours. Stand up if you work in a field that requires constant updating. For example, an engineer versus, say, a French language scholar. Stand up if you commute more than 25 miles round trip to work each day. Stand up if you live in a city you do not wish to live in because you are needed there by your employer. Stand up if you travel more than 5 days per month on your job. And stand up if you are paid on commission. So, okay, what I've just gone over is 21 of the 25 measurable differences between men and women. How many of you did, in fact, remember to keep track of the number of times you stood up? Okay, only about a quarter of the audience did keep track of that. Then do the best that you can to estimate. How many stood up at least 10 times? Raise your hand if you stood up, you think about 10 times or more. And how many stood up 10 times or fewer? Well, obviously everybody else by definition. Good question, Warren. How many people stood up at least 6 times? Okay, about 75% of the men and about 15% of the women. So we get, even in the context of this room, a great deal of the differences between men and women. When you're out in middle America, where there's a greater percentage of people working in corporations and companies, you see a great deal of difference, particularly in the areas of the choices of fields. The choices of fields are, the fields that earn the most are clearly engineering and computer sciences, and yet and women in those fields, in every single one of those fields with just a couple of exceptions, in the subfields of engineering and the subfields of computer sciences, earn more than men do. So one of the things that I discovered, and even without the other things like greater commutes, doing work in the hazardous aspects of those fields, like people who are in hazardous fields are much, much more likely to be men. As you know, 93% of people who die at work are men. So if you have a technical field and a hazardous field, the chances of a man working in that are much greater. In each of these areas, there's a certain percentage increase that normally occurs if you increase your involvement in those fields. So for example, if a person puts in more hours per week, the average person who puts in more hours per week, if they put in 44 hours a week, what would be your guess as to how much more they make than a person putting in 34 hours a week? 44 versus 34. What would be your guess? 50% more, 10% more? 20% more? Anybody else? 50% more? It's close to 100% more. And the implications of that are enormous. The average male works 3 hours, the average full-time working male works 3 hours more per week than the average full-time working female. That alone accounts for 70% of the pay gap difference. But looked at in terms of opportunities for women and for men, if a person who works 44 hours a week makes almost twice as much as a person working 34 hours a week, not usually at the same job, of course, but a person working 44 hours a week usually is able to leverage that extra commitment into getting different types of jobs, working with different types of companies that want the person with greater amounts of flexibility. So the focus of my research was looking at these 25 differences, looking at the discrimination that still remains against women in the workplace, looking at the discrimination that is never looked at that is against men in the workplace, looking at the power of women and men to attract money that is not workplace derived, such as what I call genetic celebrity power, the ability of a beautiful woman to attract income in a lot of different ways that is not available for most men in the world. And so those were some of the sort of foci of that. What got me into all of this research was when I was on the board of NOW in New York City. Which I was on for 3 years. I used to wear the 59-cent pin. Most of you are too young to remember what that 59-cent pin was about. But for those of us aged people, that was a pin we used to wear that suggested that men earned $1 for each 59 cents that women made in the workplace. And we all believed that the gap between that $1 and that 59 cents was discrimination against women. And I was one of the people who very strongly believed that and protested against that discrimination. But one day I sort of asked myself a question that sort of got me into the type of trouble that Larry Summers got into at Harvard. I asked myself this question. I said, if men got paid $1 for each 59 cents that women got paid for the same work, why would anybody hire a man? And then I pressed myself a little bit further on that issue, and I said, well, I'm just going to go out and form an all-female firm, because obviously then I can produce things for 59 cents that other firms have to sell for $1. But I figured that maybe somebody thought of that before me, and I started asking, maybe there's something else to the whole situation besides that, because clearly, as I thought more carefully about it, if a company did hire all men and it cost them $1, and other companies hired all women and it cost them 59 cents to produce the same product, that capitalism has built into it a punishment for people who are stupid enough to discriminate. If you're stupid enough to discriminate and hire the man when the woman can produce the same product for about half that amount, you're going to be soon losing business. And the punishment will be being put out of business or going broke. And so that in a way the government wasn't necessarily needed, perhaps, I asked myself, to do what was already built into the structure of capitalism, which was to punish people who discriminated, who exercised that discrimination in terms of hiring people who were less productive for the same work and paying them more money. So I started thinking about that, and then I said, well, then maybe, if that's the case, there may be what other factors are involved that separate out men's work from women, the decisions that men make versus the decisions that women make, and could they account for the pay gap? So as I started looking at that and realizing that there's that men work 3 hours more than women and in the workplace, and I realized, and seeing that that accounted for 70% of the pay gap, I started looking at each of these other issues and seeing that even 10, 15 years ago, we had very interesting data about men and women that no one has ever heard of. So for example, or very few people have ever heard of, one example was I started looking at the differences between never married women and never married men. It made sense to me that if it wasn't gender discrimination, that maybe never married men and never married women would earn more similar amounts to each other if it was about decisions around family that was creating differences in outcome. So I went back to Jesse Bernard's book, Future of Marriage, written 30-some-odd years ago, found in an appendix to that the fact that never married women earn more than never married men. Never married women 30 years ago earned more than never married men. So I was wondering if that still was the same. And then some of my feminist colleagues rightly and accurately said to me, Warren, the reason that never married women maybe do earn more than never married men is because, let's face it, never married women are winners and never married men are losers. And while losers and winners is a pretty tough way of putting it, what was true about what my feminist colleagues told me was that never married women did tend to work more hours per week than never married men. And never married women, on average, were more educated than never married men. So I controlled for education, and I controlled for hours worked. And I found that today, men who are never married, so follow all of this here, men who are never married and never had children earn 85% of what women earn who are never married and have never had children. When education is controlled for, when income is controlled for, and age is controlled for. So I suddenly had a new way of looking at the workplace. So I said, if that's the case, then there should be a number of fields in which women maybe out-earn men, even as a rule, and found, in fact, that there were more than 90 fields in which women out-earn men. And that started getting me thinking of something different. If there are 90 fields in which women out-earn men, and all the newspaper discussions and media discussions were focusing on women as being discriminated against, we were putting our binoculars on the areas of discrimination against women, and we were missing tremendous opportunities for women. And so I started looking at and putting my binoculars on opportunities for women. And not only did I find there were 90 fields in which women out-earned men, but I also found that there were 39 very large fields in which women out-earned men by at least 5%. And I started seeing that there were fields like, and I discovered many other things in those fields. I found out that pharmacists are now earning more than medical doctors because of HMOs lowering the amount of income that medical doctors were making. So I started looking at fields that were user-friendly to women, that fit some of these categories that women usually decide to choose for. Found that investment bankers who are females not only do extremely well, but they significantly out-earn male investment bankers. Found that the dental hygienist will be one of the really major growing fields in the next 10 to 12 years. And dental hygienist is one of those fields that, well, think about it. Raise your hand if you would prefer a man's fingers in your mouth to a woman's fingers in your mouth. Raise your hand if you'd prefer a woman's fingers in your mouth to a man's fingers in your mouth. The common denominator, raise your hands, come on. Either way, and the great majority of people do prefer women's fingers in their mouth, whether they're a woman or a man. And if you think about how many of you have had dental hygienists who are men? Just 2 people in the room. How many of you have had dental hygienists who are women? And so what we realize is that there are a lot of fields, particularly fields that involve touching people or looking at people naked from both sexes, that completely discriminated against men. A man who wants to, and so I asked my dentist about this, and I said, would you hire a male dental hygienist? And he looked at me, he knows what I write about, and he smiled and he said, actually, I did have a male who's a dental hygienist. 10% of people who get dental hygienist training are men. He said, I did have a man just the other day who called me who was a dental hygienist. I said, okay, what did you tell him? I said, sorry. I said, was that because you had no openings? And he said, no, it's because my customers will not want a man being a dental hygienist. And in a lot of areas like this, think about a massage. Would you rather raise your hand if you'd prefer to have a massage by a man? Raise your hand if you'd prefer to have a massage by a woman. Okay. As a rule, massage therapists find that if they're a man, they have a much harder time getting a job as a massage therapist or being used as often. Think about OBGYNs. 20, 30 years ago, before the Boston Women's Health Collective started helping women understand the value of people attending to you in a different way, we had almost all OBGYNs were males. But today, almost all of our OBGYNs are females. But it goes in a much more subtle type of way. And if we go to Walmart, and we hear now 1.5 million people are suing Walmart for discrimination against women. But when I started looking more carefully at the lawsuit's case, I found that in all the departments of Walmart in which there is no skills needed, like they're not an auto mechanic, not maintenance, or no physical labor required, like security or risking of life, in all those departments, the people who were hired mostly were which sex? Women. So women's apparel, 99% women. Men's apparel, 93% what? Women. In every single department of Walmart, there were 90% or more women when no skills were required. So what then happens is that you then have people, because of this discrimination against men, it forces men to get skills in order to be hired. Having gotten skills in order to be hired, those skills are able to be leveraged to be promoted more quickly. And so you then have what appears to be discrimination against women, when in fact the initial discrimination is very clearly against men at Walmart or in many other areas of the country. We see this in elementary school teaching. It is very difficult to ask any friend of yours that has a degree in elementary school teaching who's applied for a job. With the fear of male sexuality, there's a great deal of fear of hiring men as nursery school teachers or discrimination against women. You could understand it, but it's still a form of discrimination. And so the difficulty is that our children don't have, especially children in urban areas that are more likely to grow up in, especially poor urban areas, that are more likely to grow up in female-only households. They go from female-only households to female-dominated school systems, and then we wonder why they join gangs for the purpose of having a male role model. So a lot needs to sort of be reconsidered within that framework. I started asking myself the question, because another feminist objection that came up to me constantly was, Warren, you know, it's not so much about supply and demand. Male bosses can be so prejudiced that they can sort of discriminate against women because they just plain value women less than men. So I started asking myself the question, okay, let's look then at companies in which women were their own bosses, in which women were self-employed. When I first started the research on that, in firms that women owned, women made 29% of what men made. That went up to 35%, and today it's at 49%. So in other words, when women have male bosses or bosses, they're far more likely to earn much more close to what men earn than when women are their own bosses. And the reason for that is when we look more closely at self-employed women versus self-employed men who own their own businesses, we find that the goals of self-employed men and women are different. The goals of self-employed women are usually to have a balanced life in which they can connect with their children and still earn money. The goals of self-employed men are much more likely to be money-focused. So it's not that there's discrimination that's the issue, and it's not that this should be any different. It's that women and men choose different foci in their work, and particularly we see this in the self-employment. So then I got another objection, which was that, well, maybe it's really part-time women. So I looked at the 2004 data for part-time women from the raw data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. I found that part-time women who earn 110% of what part-time men earn, working the same number of hours part-time. So I try to cut the data each way and look carefully at each of the dimensions of that. What I began to start seeing, if this book came to start evolving into having one theme, is that I began to start seeing that pay is not about getting power per se. That pay is about giving up power to get the power of pay. That is, each of the times that many of you stood up to do things, working more hours, not choosing. Almost every man here in the room said that you would not choose to work in the field you're working in if you won the lottery. So you gave up one dream, the dream of doing what was most fulfilling, to get a different thing accomplished, which was earning money. And so men, as a rule, have learned to define power very differently than women. Women have learned to define power largely through the help of the women's movement, and since the women's movement, as figuring out how to have control of their life, how to look inside of themselves, decide what their values are, decide how to become more of the person that you would like to be. In my opinion, that's the correct definition of power. Men have learned to define power slightly differently, feeling obligated to earn money that somebody else spends while we die sooner. And it's not I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek there, but it's also, there's a fair amount of truth to that as we sort of look at the different decisions that men and women have learned to make. So when we've looked at men, so if we go out here to take a cab back to our offices afterwards today, the chances are very good that the cab driver will be what? A male. And ask that cab driver how many hours per week he works. On average, it will be between 65 and 70. Ask that cab driver the next question. Would you choose to work this number of hours per week? You'll just about be thrown out of the cab. Then ask the cab driver the question, why do you work this number of hours per week? And the cab driver will usually tell you some version of the following. I'm working this number of hours per week so my children don't have to work this number of hours per week, so my children can go to college, so my children can have advantages that I don't have, so my wife can take care of the children, so that my wife can have food on the table and the mortgage payment made. The mistake I think that we made in the last 30 years was assuming that people who had money had power, that people had money as a result of privilege. And what I began to understand as I did the research for Why Men Earn More was that people had money because they sort of oftentimes made sacrifices to get the power of pay. So I began to start seeing what I call the pay paradox. And the pay paradox was basically that men earn money, therefore men have more power, and men earn money, therefore men have less power. And women earn less money, therefore women have less power. Women earn less money, therefore women have more power. Because in the process of earning less money, oftentimes the money that was earned was less because there was a greater amount of fulfillment in the occupational choice. The greater the amount of fulfillment, the greater the supply, and the greater amount of fulfillment, often the less the demand. So teachers don't get paid as much as we often say they should, because more people would prefer to be a teacher or a librarian than more people enjoy reading books than smelling garbage. So we have to pay our garbage collector more, even if the garbage collector isn't as well educated, then we have to pay the librarian or the teacher, because the librarian or the teacher, the great majority of people prefer being a librarian or a teacher. Therefore, that increases the supply in relation to the demand. Basically, I began to see that it's simpler solution for us to blame men about the pay gap than it is to engineer our own bridge to higher pay. And yet when people do engineer their own bridge to higher pay, women today out-earn men when all those things are controlled for. And you will see statistic after statistic that will appear to disprove this. You will see that male doctors earn more than female doctors, and you'll say, ah, that Warren Farrell guy, he was wrong. And yet as you look more carefully, you'll see that the male doctors are more likely to be cardiac surgeons, and the female doctors are more likely to be psychiatrists. And then as you look more closely, you say, ah, I got you again, Warren. The cardiac surgeons who are male out-earn the cardiac surgeons that are female. Is that true? Yes, it's true. But when you look more closely, the cardiac surgeons that are male are more likely to work more hours per week as cardiac surgeons than the cardiac surgeons are female. And then you say, I'll control for the hours. You control for the hours, and you say, ah, the males still out-earn those cardiac surgeons, still out-earn the female, maybe only by 1% or so, but it proves you're wrong, Warren. Then you control for private practice. The male cardiac surgeons are more likely to be in private practice. The female primary cardiac surgeons are more likely to work for a government agency or some type of public practice or an HMO or something along those lines. And as you control for all of those variables, that's when the women out-earn the men. And for me, the importance of this research, and what intrigued me about it is I have two daughters, one's 17 and one 18. They're entering the workplace. I want them to understand, take responsibility for their choices. I want them to be able to know where and how to make the choices that are productive for them and their lives, and be able to not walk around feeling angry at the world that men have basically figured out a system to get themselves to be paid more at the expense of women. If that exists at even the 0.5% level, we have to change that. And if that exists, it means we have a contempt for women that needs to be changed. But fortunately, it doesn't exist. And as I started doing the research on this, I became very pleased that the world was a little bit fairer than I thought it was when I started out in this work. Thanks very much.